Tonight, President Trump fighting back against Steve Bannon, saying his former chief White House strategist has, quote, lost his mind. It all comes ahead of the release of a new book in which Bannon is reportedly quoted calling the 2016 Trump Tower Russia meeting treasonous, among other slights. This afternoon, Mr. Trump discrediting his former advisor in a lengthy statement, quote, Steve Bannon has nothing to do with me or my presidency. When he was fired, he not only lost his job, he lost his mind. Steve had very little to do with our historic victory. Doesn't represent my base. He's only in it for himself. Steve was rarely in a one-on-one meeting with me and only pretends to have had influence to fool a few people with no access and no clue whom he helped write phony books. The White House is unfazed by the latest developments. Sarah Sanders says this has no effect on the president, his agenda, and his base.
I don't think it does anything to the president's base. The base and the people that supported this president supported the president and supported his agenda. Those things haven't changed. The president's still exactly who he was yesterday as he was 2 years ago when he started out on the campaign trail. His agenda hasn't changed, and he's continuing to fight for and push for that agenda. And I think the base is extremely excited and happy with the job that this president has done in his first year in office. Look at all he's accomplished. I think they're pretty happy with where he is.
Okay, so disruptive today, to say the least. But, you know, this coming out kind of a bombshell because the recent reports have been that Steve Bannon was still in, good accord with the White House, that he was in communication with the president. But it seems like this was a direct shot at the president's son, at Don Jr., in this book. And you see the president responding like rapid fire.
Yeah, this is like one of those, we all been there, those summer flings. An intense affair, and then it just turns to boiling bunnies. Once it's over, everything just gets ugly. I read that excerpt, and I have to say, I don't know how much this actually matters, because my take home from all of this is nobody there expected this to happen. And they didn't change who they were. None of these people changed.
By this, you mean him getting elected?
Yes. And so they didn't change who they were. They're the same people. They're not politicians, and they're kind of feeling their way. And I'm reading this stuff, and I'm going, it's still better than Hillary. You have a choice, a businessman who did this as a lark. He did this as a lark, or someone who felt entitled to the job and felt that she didn't have to do much of anything and that she deserved it. And then there's a guy who kind of just waltzed in, surrounded himself with some interesting characters, some that maybe he regrets. But I think we can enjoy all this delicious gossip. But ultimately, this is a hell of an experiment. This is a hell of an experiment. A non-politician who won and surprised everybody, including apparently himself and his family, and is now doing a damn decent job. I mean, I'm sorry, but we've gone through some of these accomplishments.
Yesterday, in fact.
And yesterday, let's roll that tape.
You're not
kidding. But you know what I'm saying? It's like, he's actually doing better than most politicians could ever hope for. That's kind of interesting. It's an experiment that we're all living through at once. It's unique. It's phenomenal.
Okay, so in your expectation, he exceeded all expectations of people.
Look, I would say at Fox News, I was in the top 4 critics of Trump. And it's because I didn't know what to expect from him.
That's relative.
Yeah, it is relative. A lot of them are gone now, so maybe I don't know.
Yeah.
But anyway.
But you know what? He may be not stuffed down to the...
Yes. But anyway, my point is, given what we know about back then and what we're seeing now, who cares about that?
Okay. Dana, what's your take on it with the communication?
Well, I took it from just a different perspective of dealing with books in Washington, especially when you work for a sitting president. If you think about George Stephanopoulos, when his book came out during the Clinton administration, it was a really big deal. And he was basically cut off from them for a really long time with advisors like James Carville and Paul Begala basically saying, you are dead to us. Scott McClellan during the Bush administration wrote the book that I was the press secretary at the time.
Right.
Scott had hired me. I was super upset about it because I knew Washington loves a story. Americans, you dig into it. And one of the things President Bush called me into the Oval Office and said was, I hear you're upset about this book, but I don't want you to worry about it. And I said, well, can I throw him under the bus first? And he said, no, I want you to try to forgive him. And he said, believe me, no one's going to think about this in 3 weeks. That could be true here, except for 2 things. Yeah. One, I think that is positive for Republicans in the long term, and one thing that could be trouble ahead. One is that the severing of ties between President Trump and Steve Bannon for good is actually probably good for continued cooperation for the types of accomplishments that Greg was alluding to, especially on the legislative side of things. Because if you don't have the constant pushing against Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan from Bannon, then you actually allow them to work together and be able to accomplish things. And you probably don't have to worry about Steve Bannon trying to primary all of those incumbent senators that he wanted to do. The thing I think that was eye-opening about the excerpt that Greg's referring to that Michael Wolff writes about is that in one of the quotes, Steve Bannon talks about that the issue here really isn't anything that had to do in 2016. It was before 2016, and it's about money laundering. And he talks specifically about Jared Kushner. And that, to me, was the one where I was like, I'd pay attention to that if I were them. In the president's statement, he doesn't address any of the claims. He does call him a staffer, which is a real burn. And I remember Matt Lauer asked President Bush when his book came out, why didn't you write about Scott McClellan in your book? And President Bush said, because I didn't think it was relevant. And that's the way that you try to sort of push these things out of the spotlight. This will be a story for a couple of days, and then it'll probably move on. But that piece that I talked about, the money laundering one, was eye-opening.
Okay, Jesse, I think it's interesting because the president went out of his way to make these statements as like he has past knowledge, information, experience, where he had problems with Bannon, et cetera, and believed some of these things to be occurring in the past when he was there, right? But I know that they still were in communication once Steve Bannon left the White House.
Yeah, I'm surprised he didn't say, I didn't even know Steve Bannon. The story's either fake news or if it's real, but either way, it helps the president. Because if it's fake, the media shot itself in the foot. And if it's real, then Bannon's weakened and there's going to be no more Roy Moores. I read the first couple paragraphs. There's 3 big lies. Trump didn't want to win. Melania cried when Trump won, and Kellyanne Conway didn't think they were going to win. I know those are all lies. And then you have Bannon saying that this whole meeting at Trump Tower was treasonous. And then in 60 Minutes 2 months ago, he said the collusion thing was a farce. I don't know what to think. This guy, Wolff, has a terrible reputation in his own industry. People say he's a gun for hire. There is a complaint that I think the last book, 12 people came forward and said, all of the quotes attributed to me were completely manufactured.
Well, he talks to quite a few people.
Yeah, he talks to a lot of people, but he's got a reputation for inventing things out of thin air. With that said, if this stuff is true, and Steve Bannon said the President of the United States' son is a traitor and is weak and could crack, and his son-in-law is sleazy, then not only is that incredibly disloyal, it's stupid. And Trump values loyalty almost above everything.
Being a team player.
Being a team player, and this was something the Mooch actually previewed when he said what he said, supposedly off the record. And so if this is true, he has no credibility now going into the primaries, which I think is going to be good because no one's going to want to give him money, so that could actually help the president. He doesn't have to deal with any of that primary stuff.
Okay.
I take it at a very personal level. I think that Dana, in terms of the legislative prospects, very astutely and professionally laid out the impact. I think it will be a positive impact, the fact that Bannon is now in exile. But et tu, Brute, you talk about treason. Who is the traitor here?
Yep.
Steve Bannon is the traitor, this scum. How dare he? How dare he? I mean, what he did to Donald Trump Jr., I mean, that's one thing. I think that the best defense for Donald Trump Jr. in that infamous meeting at the White House, not being nefarious, is that he was so naive. There was no lawyer there. He was so inexperienced. He was so over-eager, over-enthusiastic. To me, that's his best defense for Donald Jr., that he didn't intend to collude with Russians in any way that was illegal anyway. He wanted to get whatever information he could get. Who wouldn't take that meeting, he was thinking, in those days?
Do you believe he said these things?
I think, but to me, the worst thing that Steve Bannon did in this whole episode is to suggest very strongly that Donald Trump Jr. is sitting in that Trump Tower a couple of blocks from here, surrounded by these commies. And then after the meeting, Steve Bannon Jr. says there is zero possibility he didn't take these Russians upstairs to meet his father. The Washington Post, the New York Times, every investigative reporter in this nation has been striving to connect Donald Trump with that meeting with the Russians and has failed to do so. So now here is Steve Bannon suggesting you could take it to the bank, zero possibility it did not happen. To me, that is and this is the guy who was his best friend for at least those few months.
Well, and chief strategist
really
and coming on board. So, yeah, that's why when Jesse, when you mentioned that, saying that it's disconcerting because somebody was supposed to be on the same team, with the president, very loyal, advising him, trying to transform, American politics and the forgotten men and women across the country. You don't do it by making these kind of very strong statements and taking a swipe and trying to take out the president's son and the family and essentially the president himself.
And he's given the left and the media a weapon to then hurt the president with, because a lot of these same people have said for a whole year that Steve Bannon is this horrible person. He's this racist. He's this propagandist. And now they're taking him for what he said and using, now all of a sudden he's a truth teller. And they're using this against the president to hurt them. And, it's just sad. The whole thing's sad, and it didn't need to happen.
One quick point. Greg suggests that President Trump did this on a lark. I've known him a long time. He started telling me he was going to be president of the United States in 1998, 1999, 2000. He was going to run as a Reform Party candidate.
Do you have that on tape?
He wanted to be president more than he wanted to make money.
Yeah, but I believe that he had doubts the way everybody had doubts towards the end. So I buy into the idea that everybody was surprised. As for Bannon, I believe he hated the family because the family provided insulation from Bannon. Those were the only people that were in his way, because I think Bannon saw Trump as a vessel for his own disruptive principles and agenda. He wanted to disrupt. Bannon.
Well, because he didn't like the globalist tendencies.
Yeah, but he was also. Bannon is a radical. He's a radical. He wants to disrupt. He doesn't have mild opinions. Every opinion is the extreme opinion. So, look, Ivanka would despise somebody like Roy Moore, who embraced Roy Moore, Bannon. So that's the difference, and that's what you're seeing.
And she could run circles around him intellectually, so please.
All right, we're going to see where this goes from here. Let's see. Check your Twitter accounts.